Cynicism is just another form of cowardice. For our sergeant are not interested in a midlife crisis. We were to do our freaking work.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 17 of the Spotlight Podcast, Success Stories for Veterans, where it is our job to break down and analyze titans from both the military and civilian communities to discover their mindset, their strategies, and their tactics so that you can take those and apply them to your life and ultimately your transition. Those titans range from New York Times bestselling authors to former heads of state to other divergent thinkers who are out there dominating their field by challenging conventional wisdom. And today we are interviewing David Rutherford. And David has worked with the SEAL teams. He's worked with Blackwater. He's worked with the CIA. He's gone on to start an award-winning podcast. And he even worked with the Boston Red Sox during their World Series winning 2019 season. And he focuses a lot on mindset. So how does he go from what he's done to what he's doing now, working with teams like the Boston Red Sox? Listen and find out. We're live. So, David, for people who aren't familiar with your work, I've become intimately familiar over the past 2 weeks. I've been studying everything you put out there. But for those who aren't familiar with you, give me the high notes.
Oh man, geez. I'm a recovering Navy SEAL, I should say, with a background, 8 years in the teams, combat medic, one combat pump with the teams in summer of 2002. Got out prematurely because of my own frustrations with the bureaucracy of the Navy, and also the stark realization that I probably didn't have what it take to make it over to SEAL Team 6. And then also had a significant challenging experience go down with me in that pump, and that jilted me quite substantially. So I punched out early, failed miserably and fast, and then went to work for Blackwater. Regained some confidence, and then in an experience in my second trip to Afghanistan with them, I was training counter drug commandos, mentoring them on missions. And in that experience, FrogLogic was born out of that. And my desire was to want to try and help children cultivate the right mindset in order to push through that transitional phase of pre-adolescence, moving into that preteen and that kind of middle school area, to give them some tools to help in that identity transition. And so after 2 years with Blackwater as a curriculum specialist, I started FrogLogic and was building that up, spoke to about 7,000 kids in a couple years. And then the economy collapsed and had the opportunity to work for the CIA at that time, where I worked for 2 years, training case officers, essentially how to behaviorally integrate with special operations teams that they were cohabitating in these FOBs downrange, which was the first time it really happened since Vietnam. And really the first time that your I don't want to call them basic, but your introductory case officer was operating fully in wartime environments. So mixing the farm with selection or ranger school or buds or whatever, those cultures clash pretty substantially. So for 2 years, I taught a course, and then had to put my money where my mouth is, and started and deployed for 2 years with them as a close protection specialist and kind of security specialist downrange for 2 years. And then 2011, gave that up, kind of hung the proverbial bulletproof vest up for good, and went full tilt with FrogLogic, really kind of on the miraculous and divine intervention of a former teammate I'd gone through training with, a guy named Kyle Kroberger, who's just a beautiful person and friend, who was working for a top financial company, and they use motivational speakers all the time. And I had developed enough content that was out there after the Bin Laden raid where, all of a sudden you search Navy SEAL motivational speaker and I'm popping up all over the place. So I started getting calls.
Nice.
So he said, man, I remember him calling me up and he's like, Rut, what's up, brother? I'm like, hey, man. He's like, are you still speaking? I'm like, yeah. He's like, do you suck? And I'm like, come on, bro. I could tell a tale, man. And so he said, listen, there's 42 wholesalers in my company. If you're good, then my buddy will use you, then his buddy. And that year I did about 30 events for this company, and it launched my speaking career. And since then, it's just, developed and gotten bigger and bigger and bigger to where now I probably do 40 to 50 speaking events, paid speaking events a year with, everybody from Fortune 500 companies to professional sports teams, collegiate sports teams, nonprofits. And then my behavioral coaching has really and performance coaching has really exploded in the last several years. And kind of the bright line for me was in 2018, I was able to work with the Collegiate World Series champion Oregon State Beavers, as well as the Boston Red Sox and their world championship team. And that was the third year I'd been with the Boston Red Sox. So, this past year I worked with Green Bay Packers, Penn State men's lacrosse team. So it's and then the podcast, I started my first podcast in 2013 before anybody knew what it was. And it was called Navy SEAL Radio. And I did about 94 of those shows and amassed a little under 2 million downloads in a couple years. And then just had the incredible honor of connecting with an old student of mine and a person I admire tremendously, Marcus Luttrell. And he and his wife approached me to see if I wanted to do a podcast with him. And that's how the Team Never Quit podcast was born. And then we brought in another friend of mine. We call him the Wizard because he's still operational. And we started this thing. And I'll tell you, Carson, it was insane. I mean, within 6 months, we were nominated as one of iTunes' top podcasts for 2016. Within 3 years, we had 15 million downloads. We, had signed a deal with Westwood One, a major network of carrying, online streaming content. And they were building out their podcast network, and we were up there next to Ben Shapiro and, all these people had massive shows, and we were just kind of sitting around pinching ourselves. The challenge for me, though, came when I was on the road for 70% of the year, back to that kind of deployment-esque schedule. I had gone through a real challenging divorce and had met a person, this incredible woman who had essentially changed my life, changed my focus in life, brought me back to a center point of existence, that Zen state. And she had 2 daughters and I have 2 daughters. And so now I have 4 daughters, a fiance, and I'm never home.
Yeah.
And I said to myself, this is the fastest way to lose what God has put in my lap. So I made the very difficult decision to walk away from the Team Never Quit podcast. I shut down a tremendous amount of charity work that I was doing, nonprofit, pro bono speaking and hosting and emceeing events. I curtailed a lot of my speaking events. So I wasn't doing, because I get hit up all the time by people saying, hey, can you come and speak? We don't have any budget, but can you come and speak? And for many years, I would just do that. If it hit me in my heart and God kind of spoke to me with it, then I would go do it. But now with the ages that our daughters are at and the fragility of what the human condition brings and offers us daily through our suffering and our pain, I made the distinct commitment to really focusing on my family, my relationship, and also myself. And so that's kind of the short version, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, and we're going to have some good questions coming up from that, because there's a lot to pull apart within that. And One of the things that I run into a lot is specifically when we're talking about ambitious veterans, kind of doing the exact same thing. They get out, they wanted their freedom, they wanted to chase their purpose, and the next thing they know, they're buried again. And they feel like they can't get unstuck. What's changed for you since you've begun saying no to all of those things that you started saying no to? What's been the impact?
Man, that's a great question, right? Because for my 3-year transition, that was really the dark years, the dark years from '03, June '03 to really, I would say July of '06. That was really bad time for me. And in '06, I really began to shift my focus to say, I need help. I need to change my approach. I need to reevaluate what has meaning, what doesn't, what real purpose is, what isn't. And also being able to adjust my perspective of what it meant to be a civilian versus what it meant to be an operator, right?
Yeah.
And it was something I didn't want to let go of, as many of us don't. And in any identity transition phase of any life, we sink our grasp into those very things that give us relevance, right, to the
Yep.
grander perspective of others, because we think we have to have that. We can't stand on our own 2 feet. We can't verbalize who we truly are because we don't know, essentially.
Yeah.
And then from '06 probably till literally, about 2 years ago when I met Jana, I didn't say no. And I didn't know how, because I thought by building my brand,
Yeah.
and really it was, I do what I do because it's therapy for me,
Yeah.
right?
I completely understand that. Yeah.
Yeah, right. You wake up every day, and listen. I mean, as you are well aware of, the Marine Corps indoctrination process is, I mean, that's some of the greatest that's one of the greatest programs that's ever existed
Oh, completely agree.
throughout humanity. And what they're able to take these young impressionable 17, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old kids and turn them into Marines, as well as, and our program is pretty substantial as well too, in buds, and so that creates a dynamic, an internal dynamic, psychologically and emotionally, where, man, you're almost being pulled in two separate directions,
Yeah.
because you want to serve the mission, but you're in the middle of that service. You're not quite sure how dysfunctional it's going to make you post when you hang it up, but
Yeah.
but you think, and then when you get out, it flips, and then they're pulling away from each other, right, instead of serving each other. And it took
Yeah.
me a long time how to extrapolate the sense of servitude on a higher level, to where, man, I need to serve myself first. I need to serve my family next. I need to serve others after that. And I need to keep that in check. So, man, up until 2 years ago, I mean, I'm 47 years old, and it's been a substantial challenge for 15, 16 years, man.
I like how you describe that as basically being pulled apart and then, rebounding the other direction, flying right by each other. Cause that's exactly what I hear veterans talking about. It's like, I had this identity etched into me, and now I don't know how much of it to let go, how much of it to keep, what's relevant, what's not. What would you say? I mean, what would you say to an ambitious vet or somebody who is about to get out about that identity issue that you wish you would have known, whether it's how to attack it or just how to, deal with it?
It's that probably, is the greatest challenge that we face, uh, as veterans, as human beings, in this life. And it like a great way to try and understand it is to try and understand your relevance, right?
Right.
When you're in a platoon, you're relevant, and your relevance is anchored, and your purpose is anchored to this massive altruistic or self
Yeah.
actualization process, or however you want to look at your reference system of life and death. because no greater service is keeping your brother alive. And out of that, and also getting rid of bad guys, right? And so you have this immense concept that's built into the evolution of the human existence, right? Is survival, right? It's in our core root physiology in terms of our limbic system, the amygdalas, the way our brain function is, that's that fight or flight. And now when you give it purpose and you wrap it into these really beautiful contextual evaluations, right? Where, man, the more I give, the greater probability my teammates will survive. The more I give, the greater probability I'm going to destroy evil. Those are massive concepts for a young person to process.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden now these pillars that hold your soul up, right? They prop up your psychosis, they prop up your psyche, your id, your ego, all these things. They're gone.
Yeah.
And man, immediately. But the funny thing is they're not. They're still there, but it's just figuring out how to attach a different coating or a different armor or a different sheath to these things, right? So then they can prop you back up, that you can still put on, because you don't lose the lessons. They can't be unwritten in your synapses, right? You can't unwrite these memories, in particular the hard ones, particularly the really hard ones, right? The way trauma is ingrained in our brain. But what you can begin to do, man, is you can begin to reevaluate in a more grand sense of freedom, right? Because in the military, what we bitch and moan about every day, right? A bitching sailor's a happy sailor. A bitching Marine's a happy Marine, right?
Exactly right.
And so what we can do is we don't have to lose these things. We just need to be able to open the expanse of potential and then reassess within the context of service. And what I always say, if you get out and you're struggling, go serve someone in trouble. In terms of, Carl Jung and Jungian theory and the archetypes that he created, right? The hero archetype is one of the most beautiful archetypes to live within, but also one of the most destructive, because if you're not saving other people, you don't feel valued. And so you have to be able to restrain the intensity of that probability, because remember, most civilians, they don't have the framework that we're indoctrinated to. If you just like your training, F field training manual FM 001 TAC 923, this is how you take a shit every day, right? We civilians don't have that. They kind of make it up as they go. And so the great challenge is when you begin to say, all right, there's a person in need, I'm going to go offer my service to them. Man, you have to constrain the fact that they don't have a program. They don't have a reference system. They don't have a place. They don't have a foundation or a cornerstone that you do. So you have to be more free in how you serve others. You have to be more patient. You have to work within that person's understanding of their own reality. And that's what gets so frustrating for us. So in that transition, in that price, stop for a second and just go serve something, right? Pick an organization that has some philanthropic, some nonprofit that gives you a sense of purpose, maybe has a little edge to it too. All right. We need that edge. We need that excitement before we make the transition into like, dude, I don't want to die. I don't want to have bullets shot at me. I don't want to drive my car to work. We're thinking that I'm going to drive by that one and there's going to be a 2,000-pound shape charge in that sucker.
Yeah.
That's not healthy, because what it does to my brain is jack up my entire existence. So, what you want is the perspective where the healthy brain function is happening, right? The positive dopamine, you're not altering your sleep patterns. You're not causing all these hyper anxiety moments, a state of hypervigilance. You want a nice, peaceful pathway of pain, right? That's what I look for in trying helping people.
Peaceful pathway for pain. Is that
Yep.
the one? Sum that up? All right. And
That's it.
and if you are working with these people who don't have frameworks because they don't, and I know a lot of veterans are frustrated with that, especially at work. How do they, or how could they discover or help those people clarify that within that service?
The people they're helping.
Yeah.
All right. So, you referenced before we press record, Brene Brown, and there's Simon Sinek, there's Tim Ferriss, there's Gary Vee, there's Joe Rogan, there's, all these modern, Jordan Peterson, it's a little bit more academic, but there's a whole spectrum of information that is available for you to take, your basic training manual and then incorporate a higher degree of emotional intelligence. Because what you have to recognize in all of our programs, whether it's Ranger School or Airborne School or Air Assault or MARSOC or whatever it is, there's a built-in functionality that is causing your emotional intelligence to recede, right? They don't want empathy to hold a premium in our behavior. And so what they do through the training itself, but also through their cognitive influence, right? And how instructors treat us and how the verbiage they use. And, my favorite one in the Marine Corps is, what's Marine Corps war cry? Kill. Right. The fact that that's a normative verbiage that's drilled in over and over and over and over and over and over again. It's brilliant for the expectation that you're going to have an 18-year-old kid that's going to be forced to shoot some 15-year-old kid and holding an RPG. You got to do it. Mm-hmm. But for the long term, that approach is not necessarily the best thing. And so what transitioning veterans need to recognize is that there has been a sequence that they've been exposed to that has lowered their emotional intelligence, right? Where they come to the battle space, as we like to call it. They come to the battle space in life is relationships, right?
Yeah.
That's where the greatest battles we face is how we, pick potential relationships, how we evaluate them, how we flourish in them, what happens when we fail and get back in. So that's the battle space. And so what you have to begin to do is, as you have this very structured approach to solving problems, identifying threats, all these things. Now what you have to do is find whatever other influence you have out there to lay on top of that process. So as you're not just, being in that hyper reactive state of, at attention, outboard personnel, stand up, inboard, It reduces that to, hey, you know what we need to do, but what will be the best way to emotionally connect with this other individual so they don't feel threatened by me? They don't feel as if I'm condemning or condescending. They don't feel as if I think everything they think is ignorant or infantile or juvenile or weak or whatever we have a tendency to make other people feel. Because there's always a well-placed historical stigmatism that's placed on a veteran, especially combat veterans, right?
Yeah. Could you go into that stigma or what you perceive it to be? Because I have my own variation of what I think it is, but could you elaborate on that maybe for veterans who maybe haven't quantified what that is yet?
Absolutely. Stigmatisms are a very fascinating component of any organizational culture, right? They're built in and they're part of the training. They're part of the indoctrination process. And for many of us in the veteran community, the stigmatism is you're always serving others. You're not asking for help. If you're injured, you don't need help. If you don't want to project weakness, all of these built-in things that in the civilian life and regular human existence are actually attributes that govern empathy, that enhance empathy, right? And so the way people, also have stigmatisms that they place on us. It's essentially what it is judgment, right?
Yeah.
We have preconceived hierarchical judgments that overlay on people from the get-go, right? You see a professional athlete, oh, they must be entitled and all, you see a CEO, you see a garbage man, we automatically have these immediate stigmatisms that are rooted in a historical process of judgment and all these other preconceived notions, right? Generalities or profiling, if you will, in terms of intelligence concept. But what you have to do is give yourself that pregnant pause and say, all right, I think I know, but I need to get to understand this individual more. I need to do the reconnaissance on the person. I need to do the proper evaluation of the target itself. And that way, I'm not going to allow my indoctrinated preconceived notion of stigmatisms to affect the potential developing relationship. And so everybody's got it. And so one of the things that I always try and do is, self-deprecation is a wonderful way to offset stigmatisms, right? Or general, judgment or whatever, to say, hey, listen, I know you might think because I have Navy SEAL next to my name or CIA, you might have this concept, but I'm just a regular guy who was able to endure this thing, right? Yeah, I have some different unique perspectives. I've seen some things in life, but I want you to know I'm coming at this relationship from just a normal person that's really trying to increase my life by getting to know who you are, and I'll do the same thing for you. Let's have that mutual, and at the very minimum, offer that olive branch in a very functional way. Like you sit down and say, hey, listen, actually spell it out for people. Because so often we live in these false perceptions because we're too afraid to get to the truth of what we're thinking with each other, because we don't want to hurt people or we don't want to influence in the wrong way. So just say, hey, listen, I want you to know these are my intentions and what are yours. And you give that. And that really helps even the playing field. And so that way you're not sitting up here, conjuring up, right, this completely false narrative that you believe the other person is having about you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great way to say that, conjuring up the false narrative. I couldn't agree more. In when you get involved in those conversations, you mentioned the pregnant pause. Are there any frameworks that, as I'm working in and I'm hooking and I'm jabbing out there and I'm trying to build relationships or not screw them up, are there any frameworks that you utilize to make sure that stays on track?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's always a good what do we do through every training evolution? At the end of every training evolution we have in across the military,
Yeah, debrief.
Debrief, hands down. The civilian world does not debrief.
No.
They like to think they debrief, but they don't debrief because nobody wants to be held accountable and nobody wants to openly admit and be honest about their failures, right? Everybody's always protecting the potential perception that you're not exactly what you say you are, right? And we do it in the military too, but we have the checks and balances that are in place through, all right, if you can't hit a 3x5 card at 15 yards, you ain't going in the house. It's that simple. You haven't done the work you needed to do. And so we have that. Civilian world, not so much. So the debrief becomes an essential component. And it's also a way that brings forth a nice militaristic concept that all people can admire because they recognize the value of the debrief. So offer it as this, hey, maybe, at the end of the week or something, a colleague or somebody at work, a manager or someone beneath you, hey, let's sit down and have a debrief. Let's just, and it could take 10 minutes and say, hey, these are the structures. And you can stop. Do you have any comments, concerns, or gripes with me? Is there a way I'm speaking to you that doesn't make sense? Or is there a way that's a little too aggressive? I realize that, where I'm coming from in my past might be construed, but that's not really what's in my head. It's just the vernacular that I'm used to. It's the tone that we use every day. It's elevated. There's an imposing sense to it, as well as a time, right? Everything's so evaluated by time. And so give a little, offer that opportunity to get a debrief. And if you're not willing to get the debrief from the person, then, have somebody that is your swim buddy, a close friend, your wife, a friend, give you a debrief at the end of every week. Tell them, hey, this happened. I went through this situation. I didn't quite handle it. What do you think? And they should give you some honest feedback.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. I think it's an opportunity to go back to your other point about self-deprecation, right? That's an opportunity to create that space. I love integrated systems. So when I see an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone, I'm all about it.
Yep.
Now, you've obviously shifted your mindset a lot since this whole process of getting out and kind of getting back in and then doing Blackwater, CIA, all of these things. Have there been any particular resources, whether it's a book or an individual, that have really driven that and shaped that mindset?
Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of interesting. When I was in college at Penn State, I was an art major with a minor in poetry. And so I'm a hippie who can kill you, right? And
I'm convinced all vets are hippies. I'm convinced we're all Willie Nelson, basically.
Yeah. You look at the great actors in the post World War II era, man. All these guys were these brilliant, amazing operators downrange, and then they went on with these very creative careers.
Like Chris Christopherson is my top example of that.
100%. I mean, just this wonderfully artistic person.
Yeah.
And it really makes sense because, the greatest aspirations we have are to try and make sense of the dualities of life. And so, if you live in the rigidity of the warrior mindset, you also have to balance it out with that sense of creativity and the accessibility of how beautiful life can be as well, because then it really defines what's worth sacrificing for, right? And it's good to do that. So I had this very extensive background in art and philosophy and psychology, in college. And so probably about 2005, I think, was the first time I picked it back up. There was a book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And this book is about an Austrian psychiatrist who was wrapped up by the SS and sent to Auschwitz and ended up going to 3 of the worst prison camps there are. Ended up finishing in Dachau, and he tells this really insane story about the process of what happened to him and the denigration of his dignity down to the place where he was worth less than the ink that was in his arm, right? And he was able to do it in a way that only a psychiatrist can effectively describe this. And then he talks about that divine moment where immediately his entire existence is reinvigorated with the ultimate sense of validation, which is the love from another person, right? And he was able to come back from the depths of wanting to commit suicide because he realized that no matter what he faced in life, no SS soldier, no mad scientist could strip him of that reality that he knew for a very significant portion of his life, that he was loved by another human being, therefore ultimately loved by the presence of God in his life. And so that was a major shift for me. And then, since then, I've gone on to become a pretty voracious reader. I right now I'm reading the handbook on positive psychotherapy. I'm reading a book about THC. I'm reading a book, post-apocalyptic science fiction book right now.
You got to do that. I'm telling you, not enough people are out there reading fiction. I read Robert Jordan. The Wheel of Time series has me entranced. I love it. I love like magic and fantasy and all that stuff. Why would you not?
I do. And it's funny. A young man that I've been mentoring since he was 12, he's about 28 right now, just made it through a program at a tier 1 unit. And we chat regularly, and he asked me, he goes, what are you reading right now? And because I always, what are you reading? What are you doing on leadership? What are you doing? And I listed all these, historical books, these psychology books, and he's like, what are you reading for fun, man? And I was like, nothing. And so the student became the teacher in that moment, as I'd always hoped he would, and he is substantially becoming that. But he offered this great, this amazing series, and so it's called Red Rising.
Red Rising
by Pierce Brown. Yeah.
All right. Well, once I finish the marathon that I'm in right now with Wheel of Time, Pierce Brown. All right.
Yeah. Try start out with Man's Search for Meaning. It's in any coaching client I have, or mentoring client, or working with an athlete or whomever. I always start them with that. It's just, the commonality we all share is pain. Yeah. We do not share in our successes that much. We more so in the military, because it's ingrained into us to feel pride in the success of our teammate or swim buddy. But in the civilian world, that ego is enhanced much more significantly, to where jealousy, all these other nasty emotions come into play. And so I always start people in this to create a greater baseline of empathy. One of the greatest challenges that we face and have faced throughout human history is our lack of empathy in the right time. And so that this book forces that. And even if you're insanely reluctant to acknowledge the devastating reality of being in a Nazi concentration camp in 1944, you will still recognize that this man's pain is on a level that most people never experience, and they're why they're on this planet for our short time we're here. So.
That's a fantastic point. I'm gonna have to chew on that one probably for about 5 days. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Is there any, because we got into fiction, we got into sci-fi. Let's go to the weird part of this interview, where are there any like just bizarre or off the wall things that you do that you wish more people did?
Yeah. It's create, right? It's creation. And I think there is a component that people just are too afraid, right? Another big thing I do with people is I have them write a poem, I have them write a song, I have them draw a picture, I have just to begin engaging in an activity where there are no constraints, right? As you're writing or drawing or whatever, making music is a beautiful one. Like there's this wonderful, I saw it on back, and that's why I love it. There's all the studies there. Ever since we now have SPECT scans, like the gloves have come off on our ability for neurological diagnosis, right, and neurological evaluation. And with this multi-billion-dollar commitment to map the human mind, and we're about ready to free up information and possibilities like we never have before. And one of the places that we've seen the most dramatic increase is in the human mind is creating music. It lights up every component of the brain, almost every area of the brain that's part of functioning, right? It lights up and turns on. We're just much like what we see, and now there's these beautiful studies taking place at Johns Hopkins and some places down in Mexico. Like we're giving veterans that are really struggling, small doses of ibogaine and ayahuasca and a lot of these other and psilocybin and
DMT and all that stuff. Yeah.
And when it lights up the whole brain, and what it's doing is it's forcing a comprehensive neuroconductivity to take place to try and formulate new neural pathways to managing this cognitive and emotional dysfunction that's taken place for whatever reason, right? So creating music does that, being creative. And what it also does is it forces you in real time to openly recognize how debilitating your own insecurities can be. Because as you draw your stick figure, you're like, God, I suck. Or
Yeah.
you write the worst poem ever. Or like my fiance, I joke with her daily. I said, you know what, my next career after this is I'm going to be a singer. And I have the worst voice that's ever in the history of voices, but I'll sing and I'll make up these crazy ass songs, like really just dysfunctional, crazy, deep, dark, nasty
Yeah.
songs. And I'm laughing. And she's like, please stop. I mean, your the sound is there. But I go, what about the lyrics? Do you love
Yeah.
the lyrics? You know? So
Well,
I'd say those are the aspects about what I try and incorporate that a lot of people would look at and be like, dude, that's really jacked up.
so I'm going to boil that down to drive your spouse crazy with your singing. Are you giving her some like death metal screams and stuff like that? Is that how weird it gets?
No, I mean, every now and then I'll pull out a little Yngwie Moinstein and sing along to that, but it's kind of a combination of like bad off Broadway meets like rockabilly, horrible country. You know? That's
okay. I like that. You might be onto something now. I mean, you can put anything on Spotify these days.
Anything's on Spotify.
I'd give it a listen. I get into some weird stuff on Spotify. I probably spend about 10% of my day messing with my playlists and be like, add. I love it.
So there's two artists right now that are just consuming me that I'm just fascinated by, and one is called Godspeed You Black Emperor, and they're just this insane band that puts out I don't want to call it melancholic, but it's got this very eclectic, theatrical, deep undertones of emotional provocation to it. I mean, it's really beautifully done. All instrumentals with some overlays of voiceovers and these on the street, and beautiful. And the other is Nick Cave, and so I in those spaces, I write a daily dose of FrogLogic that I put out on social media. At least I've released the pressure of having to do it every day. I've taken that off myself and said, if I miss a day or two, no big deal, right? Mm-hmm. And so like just the other day or yesterday, today's Wednesday, right? So just yesterday, I put out a poem in terms of that space where you're almost done with a bottle of scotch, your Glock's out on the table, the Bible has no relevance to you anymore, and you're really pondering that the escape, right?
Yeah.
You're pondering the end of the tyranny of your inability to find positivity in your pain, right? And so I wrote, and because I released the show with a great guy named Alex Cruz yesterday evening, who runs the 22 Project, which is a hyperbaric treatment component. And so, as I'm writing this very dark poem, I'm listening to Nick Cave, and then I'm switching to Godspeed You Black Emperor. And so I'm allowing these external influences, these other creative spaces, to spark my own creative juices, and to allow, there's so many incredible things that have been written and been sung and been played and been painted and been drawn, and architecture and sculpture and there's so much art in the world that can influence our own creativity. And that's what I try and do.
Yeah, I was actually reading something that Elon Musk said earlier this week when he was talking about basically most jobs are going to be automated. And unless it deals with human interaction, which goes to your point about EQ, right? You have to be emotionally intelligent. Like those types of jobs are not going to go away. Or art. Those are really the creative pursuits are really the only things that machines can't do.
And that's why you see this immense push. We're in the greatest time in human history for content creation, by far. I mean, it's some the last statistics is like more content is created on YouTube every minute than the prior 200 years, right? Or something insane like that. And so there's this real need for expressing yourself. And so within that, you have this amazing ability to really gain some true insight into the human condition, into how people think and how they react and what's important to them and what's not or whatever. And so finding those hidden gems, like you were saying on Spotify,
Yep.
finding those things that you really connect with, that's an essential part of your growth. And
Mhm.
that's what so many people don't choose to do. They're allowing their environment to manage and determine um, projection, or their how they're being propelled, and where they're going, their pathways. And that's what the challenge
Yeah.
is that nobody's been creative.
And you mentioned that you will discover your debilitating insecurities, which I completely agree with. I mean, it took me 5 years before the Zen veteran. I even opened my mouth about it. It seemed like. Do you have an example of maybe how you identified a debilitating insecurity in that process you didn't realize you had? Because
Oh,
everybody thinks
absolutely.
about SEALs are like bulletproof, Mr. Confident.
Oh no, I mean, I was a spilt pile of F, I mean, you know, I was not in a healthy space for a long, 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 long time, because I wanted to live in that world
Mm,
where platoon logic is how I govern my life, where, there's this peer evaluation that keeps you sharp,
yeah,
and it keeps you ready for confrontation. It keeps you ready for violence. It keeps you ready for all the things required in order to be a good frogman. And that is the antithesis of what you need in life. Yes, there's an aspect that you know that it's healthy to have confidence. It's healthy
mhm,
to not be able to stand up for your beliefs. It's healthy, but it's not healthy at 45, 47 years old, 10 years out, and you're get ready. Somebody says something to your wife, or does something to your kid or whatever, and you're ready to grab somebody on the t-ball field and ready to choke them out,
yeah,
and back stomp the back of their neck and break their teeth out, like American History X, on the curb. So
great
that's not.
reference.
Yeah, right. I mean,
Yeah,
it's probably one of the most intense visuals
yeah,
that's ever happened in cinema, for that type of destructive mentality, that kill or be killed mentality. So yeah, my dysfunction came in my uncontrollable anger.
mm,
My dysfunction came and still comes in when I lose control of that tempered response. The switch gets flipped, and I default back to that survival mechanism by attack, by going on
yeah,
the attack, right? And whatever that looks like, whatever spectrum that looks like, from outright aggression, where, like, if you say another word, I'm going to take my knife and stab you in your carotid artery, to just belittling other people, and,
yeah,
condescending them and treating them with disrespect, to make them small, right?
yeah.
Right? To control and put them in the right place of higher. And man, that is not a good place, a healthy place, and it's certainly not who I want to be anymore.
That's a very good point that you brought about making people feel small, because that's one of the most destructive things that I think I've seen in not only my own behavior. We're talking about it beforehand. I got fired from 3 jobs specifically for that reason, because I knew I couldn't let the outward aggression go, right? But I could make somebody feel that big. And I enjoyed it, which is weird, right?
Well,
Like you convince
it's
yourself
I
almost.
don't think it's weird at all, Carson, because when you look at what behavior is rewarded in our programs, that's rewarded,
Yeah.
right? The peer evaluation, the perpetual peer assessment, that is rewarded behavior, right? If you got, like, there's someone in who's not doesn't have their arms fully up underneath the log or the boat, what does the instructor do? The instructor pulls them out, lets them sit on the side, and says, all right, for you screwing over your boat crew, you're going to sit off to the side and take a little break while they suffer, right? And what are you doing? You're inversely causing the rest of the boat crew to eat that person's lunch as soon as they reintegrate, to chastise, to break them down, to call them out. And that's rewarded.
Mm-hmm.
But guess what? That shit don't fly in the real world.
No, you're going to find yourself sad and alone pretty fast. That was my experience, at least.
100%. And that's a great problem, but it's also a great thing to become aware of.
Yeah.
Because if you can become aware of that, you've been conditioned for that, and you've been influenced at a high level. The organizational culture of the military is profound, in particular within specific units. It's, it's more intense or less intense, and certainly in the Marine Corps, it's substantial, man. You're carrying the weight, of 240 46 years of Marines on your shoulders, right? And if you let them down, you're letting the Corps down. You're letting the country down.
Yep.
So, man, that's heavy stuff to let go of.
I completely agree. And some days I'm not convinced that I don't think you ever really do. I think the question for me was always about, how do I integrate those lessons like you talked about and layer it on top and make them effective and work for me now? So
and really, it's quieting the monster, right? It's compartmentalization, right? They teach us with the highest skill ever to compartmentalize that emotional context, right? And also to compartmentalize our morality. And that's a big, big thing. People don't spend a lot of time contemplating morality anymore, right? There's no more Immanuel Kants out there. There's no more people out there that are really evaluating their ethical framework, their value system, right?
Yep.
And as it relates to the benefit of society, as it relates to the benefit of your own subculture, right? And that becomes challenging for people because, man, my value system from the Marine Corps says if you don't like something, you're going to make it, you're going to change it, and it's going to change. Same in the team, same as everywhere else. So that's a big thing too, is people need to reevaluate it is detrimental. So I think it's the appropriate word. The detrimental effects of that, essentially the empathy being diminished from the indoctrination process.
Man, we could do a whole 3-hour episode on just dissecting morality and what it means, and maybe we should someday. But we're running out of time for today's episode. So David, if there's one piece of wisdom that if I had a magic wand I could just put it in everybody's brain from you, what would it be?
Love. To love more. There's no doubt. It is the number one thing that has saved me. It's the number one thing that saves me every day. It's the number one thing that secures and strengthens these relationships that so we desperately seek, right? Beautiful study was done at Harvard University that lasted 76 years, and it's the longest study of its kind in terms of social science. 4 curators. They took a graduating class of 31 men from Harvard, as well as 130 inner city kids from Boston, and they followed them for 76 years. And, questionnaires 2 times a year. They filled out all these. Where are you at? What's going on? What's happening in your life? Are you successful? Are you not? The whole gamut of things. Yeah. And at the end result, over the length of this process of following these people through the entirety of their lives, the defining link between all of these people was that they all had a sense that the most valuable aspect of the life were their healthy relationships. Yeah. And that they had wished they had spent more time investing in creating really healthy relationships, because that's what we need. We need those sense of value. And the way we do that is we lead with love. There's no greater message that's ever been projected by any prophet, by any academic or any philosopher or any military or personnel. Why do we die for each other? Because we love that. We love each other. We love our country, right? So figure out what your definition of love truly looks like, and also figure out, how you're going to apply that day in and day out on an individual basis.
Yeah. One to
Because,
one.
well, one-to-one is what it means, because
Yep.
every relationship requires a much different process to find that space where even when the painful moments ensue, because nobody's perfect and there can't be any expectation of perfection. You have to relieve yourself of that. In particular, if people are carrying very debilitating trauma from their past in any capacity, you have to have a level of acceptance that governs your ability to forgive in real time, which opens up a space for true, devout, divine love for each other.
Man, that's awesome. David, thank you so much.
You're welcome, brother.
Hey, everyone. Thanks again for listening to another episode of the Spotlight Podcast. And I just wanted to take a second to ask you who you think should be interviewed on the show. Who do you think is out there that's just absolutely crushing it that the veteran population needs to hear from? That's what we want to hear from you. Send us your suggestions to spotlight@thezenveteran.com. That's SPOTLIGHT @thezenveteran.com. Thanks again for listening.